So we're standing here on the underpass on the way into Crosskeys between Wattsville and Crosskeys, and we're standing in front of a mural, a really beautiful mural that's just been put here in the underpass, and the artist has depicted various scenes from the history of Crosskeys. So this is Gladstone Street in Crosskeys as it would have been, and I just love actually the way that this mural gives access to the village's past and the way that the village has changed. You can see a kind of teeming high street here with full of shops. I get fascinated in the way that these places have changed. The closure of pubs and the erosion of traditional industry. So the way that this mural kind of captures that, I think, is fascinating. I was asked by the organisers to come up with just 4 lines, just something short that they could put as part of this mural. So this is what I came up with. They wanted something to kind of express the spirit of Crosskeys, something memorable, and this is what happened. Here with the Ebu babbles past Pithead and through Park, in streets where our grandparents walked, these keys unlock our hearts. So the process of doing this, I was sort of approached by the organisers, and like any sort of public poem, you wonder whether it'll happen. And I actually wrote this, the moment of inspiration. It came to me when I was out having a meal, and I wrote it on the back of a napkin in a restaurant. And then lo and behold, a couple of days later, it was up as part of this mural. Yeah, I was just trying to distill and trying to get a sense of how I feel about Crosskeys, really, which is that the reason it matters and the reason these streets matter is because they're places that our ancestors walked, and places that people who we never got to meet but who were versions of us. You know, these streets kind of hold that history. So that's what I was trying to get into 4 lines. But I'm really chuffed that it's there, and that people coming into a place that's sort of sacred to me get to come past this, and fabulously no one's vandalised it yet, so long may that continue.
Shmai John, it's my absolute pleasure to be speaking to you here in Crosskeys on what looks like a very rainy day. If I may, I'd like to start by asking about your family and how they feature as characters and placeholders to events and emotions in so many of your poems. As you started writing, was this a conscious subject matter or a decision you made as a plausible device to ground your writing?
Yeah, I think poetry is to some extent a constant sort of process of experimentation and failure and stumbling into things, really. And I think that's really how it was with family. I think really I was trying everything in the early days to try and find my subjects, find my voice, those sorts of things. And then I think you hit on family, some poems go out there, you get a reception, you think, okay, well, I'll stick with this. But I think also there are a number of things going on. I think one is my reading of Heaney, so I really love Heaney as a poet and the way that he writes about family. Another is very, very simply looking around you and trying to figure out what you love, because the process of going into a room and writing a poem is an incredibly difficult process. So you try and take into that room something which you love, which is going to cause that poem to appear, really. And I think for me, that's how it is with family. I think so many of the poems that I admire are really about celebrating someone that the poet loves and wants to celebrate and wants to preserve. My friend John Freeman has got a wonderful poem called Marching Orders, in which he kind of outlines the reasons for his poetic vocation. And it's got this extraordinary line in it in which he describes his reason for writing as being about preserving his parents. And this line says he wants to preserve not just their memories, but them. And I think that that's a line that fascinates me constantly, because what would that mean? What would it mean for a poem not just to preserve the memory of someone who's not around anymore, but actually their essence, you know? So this ability of poems really to kind of cheat time, you know, and to be little machines that can kind of really hold someone in that way and hold our love for someone in that way, it's really something that keeps me writing, and something that keeps the poems happening, essentially. This is a poem called My Father Cycling Up a Hill, 1957, and it's about my father's work background, essentially. His family were South Wales Valley's butchers, and so my dad, as the youngest member of the family, got used as a kind of free labour in his childhood, so it's about that experience. My Father Cycling Up a Hill, 1957. It's the hill from the bottom of Factory Trip all the way up to Manor Farm, a Welsh hill, one long steep and steady climb to nowhere, punctuated by the occasional sharp or suicidal incline. These are his feet, his calves. They're pushing against the weight of the side of beef or lamb in the basket on the front of his bike. From his uncle's butcher's shop to Manor Farm is a climb so far. If I were doing it now, by car, I'd think twice. By bike? No way. Yet there he is, my father, 12 years old, the weight of the hill on his legs, setting out once a week all winter to deliver the Sunday joint to old man Hodge. These are his feet, the look on his face as he pushes. This is the sweat on his brow. His uncle pays him in promises, end of week scraps, the back of his hand. It's silly to know what I do. My father is doing this for his mother, his younger brother, for his own father, who hasn't worked properly since he got back from the war. This is his front wheel, squeaking as he inches up that hill. I know all the reasons he's doing this, and I wasn't even born then, so it's silly as can be to know what I do. That he was doing it all. Look at him, pushing and pushing all afternoon for me.
Your poems are noted for startling titles such as How to Renovate a Morris Minor, Kurt Cobain Proposes to Courtney Love, etc. And we see longer titles in the second collection, Jen. Often the palpable humour or nostalgia in these titles mask layered darkness hinting at loss of a loved one, suicide, celebration of sporting victories and more. I'd love to know more about your process for coming up with such stunning titles.
Yeah, so I think the titles, one place they definitely come from is the American writer Thomas Lux and another American writer called David Wojon, who were really important influences for me. And Thomas Lux for his comedy and his surrealism and the way that he writes about everyday life. And David Wojon, for the way that he writes, particularly about pop culture, was a huge influence. So the development of those titles was really happening around my love for those poets. It was also happening around the experience of going out and giving readings, because the experience of giving readings and thinking about, actually, you know what, there's 30 people, if I'm lucky, there's 30 people in front of me who don't know anything about me or anything about these poems. So I need to say something which is going to bring them into these poems and let them know the information that isn't on the page, the context that they need to get there. So then I started thinking about, well, these same poems are going out into the world to readers, to editors who aren't in that reading, who don't get that context, who don't get that information. And what's the quickest way, actually, of getting them into the context that they need for the page? So the often kind of a lot of exposition going on in those titles, really to get readers into the poem as immediately as is possible. The other thing that happened is that quite often with poems in the first book, I was using automatic writing a lot as a kind of generative process for poems. And what I would do not infrequently is I'd find the most interesting phrase in a page of automatic writing, and then use that as a title and use that to generate the poem. So that the process of writing the poem became a process of explaining the title, really, of thinking, well, I'm interested in that phrase, what on earth does it mean? So I'll write a poem to try and explain it. And that was a way of creating some of those poems with longer titles. I think the other thing that's really interesting in your question is what you talk about with a poem having two layers. So a poem, perhaps having a kind of silly or daft or novel kind of surface, and then what you hope is that in the process of doing that, you'll unlock something, a second subject, a subject of greater emotional importance. I love those structures which on the surface are about one thing, but get you to somewhere more meaningful. Vanessa Lampert's poem Sand is always the example that I think of when I think of that, which is about a day trip, but it's also about the emotional reality of the experience of parental divorce. So I get obsessed with these sorts of structures because I think they work magnificently. The frustrating thing I find is that really the second subject has sort of got to come to you as a surprise as the writer, that you can't sort of trick that into being, So I do end up with a number of drafts which only stay at a kind of superficial or a novel level without the second subject sort of appearing. But I'm definitely in awe of poems which do that, and I'm definitely trying or really hoping for, because you're hoping for that magic of the second subject kind of surprising you in the writing process, really.
As a poet whose sort of a journey is much more recent and who's just started in the poetry world, I'm fascinated by these titles, and I wonder if you might have any advice for poets who are younger in terms of the journey into poetry and aspiring poets about how to come up with great titles.
One of the things I find, and I find this in quite a lot of mentoring work, is that one of the ways that I think about poems is that is sort of not hugely complicated, in the sense that what you want to happen is that you want the reader to move from the top of the page to the bottom, and somewhere in that, fantastically, if it's near the end or something, really get an emotional punch, really feel something, really get an emotional wallop. To me, that's where the magic of poems is, that you can take a stranger who doesn't know you, doesn't know anything about the poems, in the space of a page, maybe something like 14 lines, and you can make them feel something. That's kind of magic, Now, what tends to get in the way, I tend to find, and this is all through mentoring, what tends to get in the way is basically confusion. So what's stopping the emotional impact happening is that halfway through the reader doesn't understand something. They don't have enough information on the page. They don't understand something about a line is too ambiguous. And so by the time we get to the bottom, instead of actually feeling, all we can feel is confusion, you know. So basically, I tend to think about, and this is really kind of a dull sort of phrase in terms of poetry, and it's not where the excitement of poetry is, but I tend to think about information management. In other words, does the reader have enough information to feel? And the titles are a way of managing that, really, of managing the process of getting quite a lot of information very early in a poem. If you, a title governs so much because every assumption that the reader is making as they move down the page is to some extent provoked or governed by the first thing that the title has made them think of. So if you go kind of oblique on title, or you take that same poem and put it under 7 different titles, the impact is going to be completely different. And of course you can get completely brilliant titles which come at something from an angle, you know. There's a really wonderful Roddy Lumsden poem about the death of turtles, which is called Mercy, and it's a brilliant title, and the relationship that generates the poem. And if I was titling that poem, I'd probably call it something like, you know, poem in which one turtle dies and then I kill another one, or something like, you know, so this ridiculous sort of exposition title. So it's about, I think it's a real art, and it's a complex art, and it's about it can really make or ruin a poem, but part of it is managing the context to get the reader to the position of feeling, essentially, I think. So this is a poem with a daftly long title. It's called Now They've Converted the Office Block in the City Centre into a McCure Hotel. And it's about a place called Chartist Tower in Newport, which was an incredibly ambitious office block that was put up in the 60s, I think. And it was a place that my dad worked when he was a younger man in the office there. And what happened quite recently was that the place was converted into this McCure Hotel, and I was interested in the way that place changes over time and the way that you can get to different times through place, essentially, specifically the courtship of my parents in this poem. Now they've converted the office block in the city centre into a McCure Hotel, so much has changed. These dozen stories, these floors of rooms filled with desks and filing cabinets all those years, stripped back now to containers for identical beds to dream identical dreams in, for identical lamps shedding identical light to see by, and at roof level, this restaurant with its expensive view across the skyline. So much has changed that a businessman staying here one night and given this room on the 2nd floor might never come close to guessing that this was the very office my father worked in all through the 1960s, checking and double-checking insurance quotes and monthly figures, looking up from time to time and sighing. Except perhaps, somewhere in mid-morning, that businessman, preparing for his afternoon meeting on the future of cryptocurrency or electric vehicle emissions, might just catch a whiff of cigarette smoke, or hear someone yell from next door that for the love of God it must be time for coffee, or looking up through the window just after noon, he might see, standing there on the street, waving up in his direction, the young woman in the co-op uniform who's yet to become my mother. Though he left the company 40 years ago, she's signalling to my father with that wave that, hey, she's on early lunch again. And if he's lucky or gets his arse in gear, she might just let him buy her a ham salad sandwich at the table in the window at the cafe on the corner.
You're noted for forming instant connections with the audiences at your readings, often being self-deprecating or telling stories about your family members. I'd love to know how this started.
So this is basically entirely a survival technique to do with managing anxiety around readings. When I started, when my first book came out, really, it was coming out into almost nothing. I published in magazines and I published in competitions, but I wasn't really giving readings at that time. I wasn't really sort of going out publicly with poetry. It was something that was happening in a room and that I was sending out, really. So then, of course, when the book comes out, and this is probably connected to often the way that the writers from Wales jump to a full collection without a pamphlet first. So there isn't so much that opportunity to kind of build an audience and kind of dip your toe in the water. So when the first book came out, all of a sudden I was having to do readings. So I was having to go and engage with audiences and drive to parts of Wales and of England that I'd never been to before. So I mean, it's terrifying. It's absolutely terrifying for lots of reasons, I think. Among them, the fact that a poetry self and what you're putting in poetry, there's a gap between that self, I think, sometimes, and the sort of various other versions of selfhood, including kind of like professional selves and an everyday self that you are to your relatives and so on. So managing all of that anxiety was almost intolerable. I mean, in the early days, I almost couldn't do readings, So the comedy came out of actually, how do I get through this? And was a way to kind of get myself through the reading. And it really became the case then that that was the bit that I enjoyed. The introductions and the interactions with the audience and the smiles on their faces and the reactions was the bit that I enjoy. I read the poem to get to the next introduction because that's a kind of spontaneous creative act, depending on who's in front of you and what's going on. I think it's informed in part by Welsh comedians, by Rod Gilbert, by Lloyd Langford, and the way that I love them. I think also very definitely more than that, it's informed by my family and by the way that we relate to each other. It's a very South Wales. The self-deprecation. It's a very, very South Wales. Valleys, Crosskeys as a village. The way that my gran was. My gran lived until 102, and at 102, she was the wittiest, most brilliantly sarcastic Dorothy Parker of a South Wales Valleys woman. And so we've always related to each other in this way. We've always expressed love by taking the mick out of each other. So that's what comes out, I think, in those introductions.
I seem to recall my first readings in the Seren First Thursday event, which used to be held at Chapter Arts for many years when Amy Wack was the poetry editor. For the first year, I was reading and my legs would be shaking. And naturally, because I think it's the stature of poets like people like I think Robert Minhimi would be sometimes there. And I wonder if we have any advice for younger or aspiring poets in terms of how they can steady their nerves.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's very difficult. I mean, my experience was that I just had to go through it, really. The first readings, I'd be driving to the reading constantly thinking that I'm going to turn around and drive back home because I just couldn't face it. I think that in my case, teaching helped a lot. So the fact that you're kind of in front of classes, you've got to keep them entertained, /educated, /occupied for the next hour, The experience of doing that, I think, was a huge help. I think that comedy and sort of not having too high expectations for it helps. I think that practice helps. I think that practice in a room on your own even helps. And I think also probably now, of course, we're in a position where there are fantastic resources in terms of seeing other poets read. So it's helpful. Danny Absey used to tell terrific stories about how badly readings had gone. You get and as the introduction to a poem, he'd give this amazing anecdote of a reading going badly. And sometimes it's pretty useful to know that it can go terribly for the most brilliant poets, that we're all in the same boat, really. You know, that's what it is. And of course now with the internet, with Zoom, you've got this access to really, really brilliant readings. I mean, Chen is one of my favourite poets in the world now, and the first time I came across him was a Zoom reading that the Ledbury Poetry Festival were doing, and I knew none of his poems, but the way that he read, the way that he introduced, the way that he put across, the way that those poems drive to the edges of humour and are able to bring themselves back to the most tremendous emotional impact. So I think there are enormous online resources now for poets to kind of access and to think, where's my style and where do I sit in this, you know? This is a poem called My Grandfather's Car. My grandfather, or my BAMP as I would call him, I love that word, had an extraordinary Volkswagen Beetle. It was a sky blue Volkswagen Beetle, the original model. In theory it was sky blue, in reality it was rust brown. But I loved that car, and it was a container for him really, and a way of exploring him. So this is called My Grandfather's Car. The suspension was the suspension of a pram, and the air inside was flavoured by his roll-ups and his working day, and the aircon was the gammy window you could never quite do up all the way, and the heating was a running joke, and each wing wept his sadness out in big brown tears of rust. I could say so much, the way he turned the engine off on top of Blackvane Hill and bobsleighed down, or how, going round a corner, he had to factor in the car's thinking time, how his exhaust was a foggy day, the tax disc a problem with the postal service, how the indicator lights like to make their own minds up about things. By now it'll be what? Broken up for parts, or gone to seed, to pots. Perhaps it will be renovated, polished, pimped by some beard twiddler who isn't him. In my mind I can still reach out now, through 30 years, take the chrome handle of the door, which opens like this, like so, with a heave, and there, in front of me, is a world that was. The upholstery, whose wrinkles, cracks, my mind made rivers of, the seat a map of everywhere we went, the cigarette lighter which toasted itself and popped, the windscreen's variety show, the gear stick, big as a dinosaur bone. The passenger seat tips up, and this is the place where I sit, here, swinging my legs over the edge and gripping so tight a steering wheel made of air, which dangled before me in my mind. I held it through every corner we turned, looked up to check and check again if I'd got it this time, at the back of a head, at the braced and balding man who laughed and moved the world.
Your poems are a map of working class Welsh lives from the valleys in the near past, but also contemporary Wales and Welsh cultural icons like Tom Jones, Catherine Zeta-Jones and more crop up often. As a Welsh poet, was there any specific obligation felt to serve as such a brilliant ambassador of aspects of Welsh lives?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. I think again with as with family really, it comes about to a certain extent as a result of experimentation and kind of messing about and finding voice and finding subjects. One thing that happened to me is that I started writing at Warwick University. So I was in a university in England, and I think the experience of being out of Wales really for the first time made me intensely aware of being Welsh. That was definitely one impact. So as soon as you're in that environment, you open your mouth and you speak in a certain way, you become intensely aware of being Welsh in a way that I don't know that I particularly thought about before. I mean, it made me very aware of my identity. So when I was first writing poems, that was an obvious subject for me to go to, because it was something that I was interested in and something that I was experiencing. I think a lot of it is accidental. So, for example, the aspect of it which is about this village and about writing about working class lives. I mean, quite often, simply, I didn't have anything to write about that day, so I was looking around myself and thinking, what can I make a poem of? So there's a poem in the first book called Colliery Row, which uses the structure of the street I live in and works its way up and down the street, and becomes, I think, and has been read as a political statement because of the sort of material and the sort of thing that you're addressing, but starts simply with, I want to write a poem today, and the experience of what do I write about, and can I look out the window and make something. I think that it's something that, I think with any poet, if you look at their body of work, then what you come to is a kind of directory of the things that they love, and I think sometimes that's almost a process of discovery for the writer more than it is necessarily a conscious decision. But very, very definitely, these things are coming out of sport. They're coming out of a love for Welsh sporting teams. They're coming out of what happens when someone opens their mouth and they speak with the dialect of this place, and they're also coming out of a passion for the history of Wales. So, Jan Morris is one of my favourite writers in the world, and the way that Jan Morris writes about the history of Wales and the working class history of Wales and the history and lineage that we've got of rebellion, of the Chartist Rising, of all of these things, and the way that actually that voice and that note of resistance that you see in those things, you can also see in the work of the Manic Street Preachers, for example. It's a voice which I think is, almost comes with like the cornflakes in this area, and is very, very powerful, I think, for anyone wanting to make art. It sort of makes the thing come. So I think it's a combination of kind of accident, but then increasingly of passion. The other, or among other writers really that were really helpful in this regard, Gillian Clarke. Gillian Clarke was really the first Welsh poet who was of major importance to me. The discovery of her work and the realization that actually I can write about what's around me. The way that she writes about the mining tragedy at Six Bells, for example, and also R.S. Thomas. I think that the way that R.S. Thomas writes about Wales and writes about the people of Wales, and the way that he creates character sketches and that he writes about community, that kind of approach is incredibly useful. If someone wants to write about a 21st century community and characters in it, there's a kind of guidebook in the poems that R.S. Thomas writes. So yes, it's really an enduring passion, that. This is a poem called Bridge. It's a monologue, and it's the voice of the bridge. The bridge gets to speak. I love writing monologues because in some way it absolves me of responsibility. The thing speaking can say what it wants to, and quite often it'll lead the poem in a direction that I might not have got to myself. Bridge. Me, I get up early, see. I like the hour or so before the cars arrive. The city sleeping there over my shoulder. The early morning sky that is all mine. A few gulls spelling out with their bodies. I make the most of that because by 9 I bear the city's weight here on my back. All these commuting cars and belching vans. I hold my nose and try to keep control with traffic lights. They lean out of their windows to swear, to drop their rubbish, spit on me, to smoke a cigarette and flick a burning butt on me. The days I like the best are Sundays, when I just lie in all day, the acupuncture of a gentle moped, or this hand-holding couple afternoon who linger at my apex, make my view the background to their love. I've heard it said our card is marked, our day is done. What with advances in technology, hot air balloons and tunnels, gravity. But what is this but human, really? To look at the distance from here to there and say, well, what's the shortest that could be? I do not like the nights, the river's tinnitus, and the low hum a taxi engine makes is like a dream of my own snoring. Worst are those who come to visit at that hour. Here, tonight, a young man walks alone towards my middle, dumbbelling a Scotch bottle under arm. He reaches midway, looks down at the river, then clambers over, stands there on the ledge and holds on tight. I feel his warm touch there. Oh souls, believe me, I'd never let go if I could choose. I know by heart exactly what it is to just have too much weight to bear.
You've been instrumental in inspiring and guiding many aspiring and early career writers as a mentor, poetry workshop facilitator, as well as editing the Poetry Wales magazine, for which many of us from Wales are most grateful. I was wondering if you would say something about how this development support may have impacted and perhaps continues to inform your own writing journey.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yes, I think you learn a tremendous amount about your own writing by working with other people and by working with what other people are doing. I think that you develop your notions about what it is that you want to do with writing, and your kind of your ideas as to what a strong poem is, or what are the frequent kind of problems or impediments to really strong writing. So I think that it's absolutely invaluable. You know, the perspective that you gain by looking at what other people are doing and learning from the process of other people, and because ultimately what happens on the page and what happens in a completed poem is a product of the processes that we go through and the little kind of eccentricities and idiosyncrasies that we develop as writers. All of those things mark us out in terms of the completed product. So I think that it's invaluable. I think it's also at times terrifying, you know, when you see the incredible quality of work that people produce. There's an inspirational quality about that, but there's also a terror, and I think sometimes the work that's out there and the quality of work that's out there, as opposed to the kind of tip of the iceberg that we see in publishing. So there's an incredible privilege and incredible eye-opening quality of working in mentoring, because you get to see actually the reality of what's going on in the world and the writing that people are producing. This is a poem called Penguins. One of my favourite poetry day trips is to go to the zoo and look at the animals and make notes and try and write poems inspired by them. So this was a day in Bristol Zoo looking at the penguins. Penguins. There on the crowded dance floor of your rock, you shuffle, nervous teens, from foot to foot. The stylus of your beak longs to break out some old school funk, some acid jazz, hip hop. But how to cut some shapes when you're all thumbs, your knees cack-handed, worn inside your body? Of course, in water it's a different story. You ride the greased toboggan of your belly downhill, launch torpedoes that you are into the pool, where world is swifter, cooler, and follow your own noses into the future. Down there on your true dance floor, you're yourselves. You limbo, mambo, soft shoe, choo-choo, boogie-woogie to your grooving heart's content. There, on the home time bus stop of your rock, you spend the afternoon, busily standing round a bit, constructing lifelike statues to yourselves. You wobble clumsy, clammy yous through rocky worlds, but in the water, man, you're someone else. Chinless wonders, Renaissance men, now piloting the submarines you are, now backstroking like an Olympic champ. You Bond girl it at last onto the shore. Waves of you reenact the D-Day landings, moving up the beach. On twiglet feet you step up now for lunch here, readying the baseball catcher's mitt of your long beak. There, on the football terrace of your rock, you point the giant foam hands of your flippers. This morning, in a high street salon, here, you groom yourself, you pluck and plume yourself, your beak forever busy on your look, then totter on stilettos down the rock. Sometimes, long afternoons, you yearn, you dream of somewhere else, you arc your head to see the net which stands between you and the sky. You draw yourselves up now to your full height. You flap and flap your arms. I watch you go nowhere fast. Oh, loves, I want to cry that you are gorgeous and you're trapped inside these bodies which are memories of flight.
Returning to your brilliant and popular collections, I wanted to ask separately about how your first and the very musical second collections came about, both lauded and the first winning the Costa Book Award.
Yeah, I mean, basically, the ambition in the first place was simply to kind of construct poems that got into magazines and did something in competitions. Actually, the first motivation is to construct a poem or to construct a line that isn't terrible, that passes today, So what happens then is that if you do that for long enough, you accumulate this body of work, and then you start thinking about, okay, well, how does this sit as a collection? And that kind of argument or creative issue that lots of people find when they're putting a collection together or a pamphlet around what's the cohesion here? Have I written on one theme? Does this hold as a collection? Because usually you're just writing. You want to perfect that one poem, really. So then you've got a body of work that you need to think about how it hangs together. And when the first book was at that stage, it was really about thinking about shape. And I ended up with these kind of loose four structures, four sections for the collection, which again comes from writers like Thomas Lux and David Wojon, because it's something that they often do in collections. So that kind of gathering of themes. There's a section about family in the book. There's a section about Wales, and I felt as though that gave me a balance between, on the one hand, a kind of the concept album, like the 1970s concept album, which can have advantages because you get this kind of fluency of theme and the idea of kind of approaching it from lots of different angles. But on the other hand, if you've got a reader who just has no interest in that one subject, then you're kind of taking a big risk. So this kind of marshalling into four sections was a kind of compromise, really, of letting in the poems that I really love that didn't really didn't necessarily sit with other things, but then also trying to get that what happens when you sustain a subject across several poems and get that kind of build of power, really. And I suppose the second section was to a certain extent imitating that approach. I mean, I think by that stage, and now when I think of a future collection, I'm thinking more with the book in mind from an earlier stage. So I'm starting to think about sequences, and I'm starting to think about writing into sequences. So I mean, monologues were there in the first book, but they became much more pronounced in the second book because I was interested in, I mean, what Liz Berry had done with a monologue in Black Country, for example. I mean, what Carol Ann Duffy does with a monologue. And the liberation that can give you as a writer, you know, the ability of the poem to come and speak through you and to reach to places that you might not have got to if the eye had a closer connection to you as the writer, you know. So I think, as with all of these things, it's a chaotic process, you know, and you come to kind of compromises which and balances really, which you hope allows individual poems to sing whilst also relating to the whole. That's really the business of it, I think.
I remember when the first collection came out, it was in television news because I went to visit an elderly friend, Ken, in Briton Ferry, and it came on the news, and we were talking about it, and that's when, you know, I mean, I wasn't buying or reading contemporary poetry then, but it made me go and buy the book for my friend Ken, and I think it's had huge impact on bringing a lot of maybe people who were not necessarily non-poetry people, but actually those who were on the verges of being interested in poetry, but they couldn't find a way in. And I think that first collection had that impact on a number of us to make us read poetry.
Well, that's really brilliant. I mean, that's a really lovely thing to say. And I think, I first got into poetry through Simon Armitage. I mean, Simon Armitage is the poet that I can first remember discovering in the sixth form college library. Picking up a copy of Zoom and reading some poems and thinking, you know what, I can understand these poems. You know, they make a sort of sense, and there's a brilliant spoken voice in these poems. There's a direct line to the people and to the situations that these poems are kind of creating. Quite often I find that poems, for all sorts of reasons, or the page even, can be a sort of a barrier, or if it's going really badly, like a wall to the situation or the people that the poem is speaking of. But I love poems like that, which give you immediate access to the life. I mean, Liz Berry's another example. The Irish poet Alan Gillis, I think, just does that in the most amazing way. So yeah, I think we're products of what we read. So that's really the thing.
Who are your poetry inspirations from the past and present? And of course, you've mentioned several names already.
Yeah, I mean, in addition to the names I've already mentioned, I mean, increasingly now, I mean, the poets that I turn to often, I mean, Mark Doty would be someone that I'd really want to mention in terms of what I'm writing now and in terms of what I'm trying to write now. I think Mark Doty just has the most incredibly elegant relationship between sentence and line and stanza, and on a technical level, that's the thing that I get obsessed with, because it's what poetry has that prose doesn't. It's kind of at a technical level the reason to stick with poetry, because you've got two types of punctuation. You've got the traditional punctuation, but you've also got the visual punctuation of the line and stanza break, and I get obsessed with how those things interact. So I think Mark Doty just does it in the most incredibly elegant way, as well as constructing just incredibly ambitious poems, and the way that he manages to write long, ambitious poems, his ability to go off in all sorts of directions, and yet somehow to get the accumulated emotion of all of that stuff landing on the ending. He just does it in the most beautiful way. So he's a writer that I think sometimes there are writers that you read and you think, my goodness, that's just so beautiful that I'm going to have to give up or something. It's just kind of terrifyingly beautiful. But over time, what you do is you work away and you work away and you think, goodness, how has this person done this? And it makes you aspirational as a writer, you know, when you come across someone that you admire that much. The other writer that I'd really like to mention, I haven't mentioned yet, is Tom French, the Irish writer, who I just think is the most beautiful poet. Particularly his first collection, Touching the Bones, which is well, it's a collection about all sorts of things. Again, often really ambitious poems about working class rural Ireland, and again about small communities. So there's so much that I take from the kind of world that he's writing about. But it's also an incredibly beautiful collection about grief and about familial grief, and the way that he's able to access that in all sorts of ways. You've just got, I think that's one of the big things with poetry is, I mean, number one, has the poet got an important subject, you know? And I think particularly with an experience of grief. I mean, grief is something that people find incredibly difficult to talk about. It's something that's very difficult to bring into everyday conversation. So when a poet is able to articulate that, I think it's of the greatest use to a reader, because you feel as though you come to it and that person has spoken for you, you know. So there's a kind of magic in that. So those two poets in particular. I mean, the other person who should almost be the person that I mentioned first is my great friend Catherine Bevis, who's writing in Flamingo and in the Butterfly House. It's just the most extraordinary poetry, and she's someone who's a friend. She's someone that I worked with in a mentoring capacity, but she just writes the most astonishing poetry. The way that Catherine articulates the relationship to the natural world in those poems, the way that she writes about animals, the way that she writes about love, and the connectedness to people and the connectedness to the world, and the way that that's at the center of poetry. And when you've seen someone kind of create poems of that quality, and you also kind of know them as a friend, that's incredibly incredibly motivating every single day, you know, to keep yourself going as a writer. I just think, along with everyone who's read them, I'm just so grateful for the beauty of those poems and the music of those poems, and I think they just give all of us something to aspire to. This is a poem called Autumn Song. The poem came about really when I went on a walk. As often happens in Wales in autumn, the leaves were completely gorgeous and they were crackling underfoot. And the first stanza of this poem came out. It's got this crazy rhythmic and rhyme stanza form, which comes out of reading Tom Gunn, really. And then the problem became trying to match that stanza form across the poem, which I didn't manage. So there became this kind of consolatory form as the poem develops. Autumn Song. I walked through a late autumn world. World was a place of leaves, all circled look, all swirled, and bumbling, tumbling, bouncing, flouncing, making the wind reel. Or if they spun, look, there, like thoughts, then what's this one I reached, I caught between my finger and my thumb? Oh, how they rise, how ride, is this a piece of autumn's fuddled mind? I walked down a late autumn street. Street was a world of crunch and unleaf-coloured leaves, all rustling, wrestling, rusting, resting, deep-fried to the touch. These trees sit in the barber's chair, these blondes, these reds, these browns, these cuttings falling to the ground, this salon in the open air, as listen, now the rain comes down, does its shampoo and set. Wind runs a hand through mountainsides brunette. I walked through a late autumn life, leaves falling through the world. These parachutists look, these suicides, beneath the wheels of cars which speed the heels of well-heeled girls. Leaves everywhere, now in my hair, now getting up my nose, now sticking themselves to the road. This superglue, this rain, now putting themselves in the post with no address or name, but everything they have of hope, of getting home again. I walked through autumn's muddled head, and all its thoughts were leaves, celebrating their own deaths, going shades of gold, which said, "Take a look at me." Trees turn themselves to skeletons, do shadow puppets in the sun, and make a bride of everyone on our late autumn street by throwing their confetti at our feet.
I always see your name in association with so many projects, including a recent project with the photographic artist and writer Zilla Bowes writing poems on trains. If I may ask, what are some of the exciting projects you are working on at present?
Yeah, the project with Zilla was absolutely brilliant. It was just one of the most fun and most exciting projects I've worked on, and I think for a number of reasons. I mean, number one, it was just absolutely brilliant to collaborate with another poet, you know, and to get that perspective and to be inspired by someone and to create something in harmony with someone else. It was also a project which kind of drilled down into place. So it drilled down into the South Wales valleys, and we were kind of travelling on trains up and down the South Wales valleys, and it actually caused me to deepen my sense of this place, but also probably to see parts of it from a new perspective. I mean, there were places up the train line, like Ebervale, that really I didn't know enough about, you know, and the opportunity to spend time with the history of those places and the people of those places was just absolutely wonderful. I mean, I'd urge anyone that the Royal Society of Literature funded that project through something called the Literature Matters Award, which takes open applications every year. And I know they really value collaborative work, and they really value getting work to new audiences. So, I mean, I'd really urge anyone to give that a go, because it can generate work that you wouldn't get to otherwise. They've often been very supportive of Welsh writers as well. I know of a number of Welsh writers who've come through that funding process. It's really a great thing. I mean, what I'd like to mention in terms of kind of current and future projects is really working more on fiction. Actually, I'm sort of desperately trying to develop short stories. That's really one of the kind of avenues I'm exploring, which is kind of brilliant and fascinating and exciting and terrifying in equal measure. It's sort of quite often they expand on the comic tone of some of the poems. So in short stories you can kind of elaborate comic situations in greater detail. I don't know sometimes if I'm being inspired by other short story writers, or if I'm being inspired by Fawlty Towers and Gavin and Stacey, you know. But the opportunity to kind of explore comic scenarios in that kind of more extended form is kind of brilliant and great fun to write. You know, I don't know if they're so much fun to read, but they're great fun to write. You can have a great time while you're writing them. So I'm hoping that that's something that I'll stick with. It's managing that and poetry together is always a business, because whenever you're spending a day on a story, you feel kind of sort of slightly adulterous about the poetry. You feel as though you're cheating on your first love, you know. But I'm hoping that's something that I can keep up and keep the two going side by side, because one informs the other, and you're often kind of flipping ideas back and forth between the two forms, and finding that an idea that starts in fiction can end up as a prose poem, or even can go into a shorter form, and vice versa. You can steal from your poems to generate ideas for stories. So yeah, that might be terrible news for the reading public, but I'm going to try and keep going with those stories as much as I can.
Well, I for one am looking forward to these stories, and I do hope that they will come out in a collection or a book format at some point soon. But Jonathan, thank you so much for speaking to me about your poetry, your writing processes, and your inspirations.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me, and thanks for all the brilliant questions. Lovely to spend time with you.
Thank you.